In this video, we're going to talk about the various environmental factors and conditions that can affect the rate or speed of photosynthesis in a plant, algae, or bacterial cell. So, let's focus on things that can change the rate of the reaction. There are four environmental factors that need to be considered when trying to hypothesize whether or not photosynthesis will be operating at an optimal rate, lower rate, or higher rate than normal. One of the main environmental considerations to take into account would be the light intensity and the wavelength. When I'm talking about light intensity, I'm talking about the concentration of solar radiation. For example, during the summer, since sunlight has to pass through less atmosphere, the intensity of solar radiation can be much higher in those summer months. Whereas during the winter, since the sun has to pass through a greater degree of atmospheric gases, the light intensity can be decreased. This can also be affected by filtration. For example, a plant growing out in the field versus a plant growing underneath the understory of a deciduous canopy. Wavelength would be the type of solar radiation reaching the plant. We talked about electromagnetic radiation wavelength in our discussion of the chloroplasts and chlorophyll, and that can have an effect on the rate of photosynthesis. Obviously, a light that would be purely made up of the wavelength we consider green would create a substantial decrease in photosynthesis, whereas increasing the blue, indigo, violet, red, orange, and yellow wavelengths would increase photosynthesis. Carbon dioxide concentrations can also have an effect on photosynthesis, right? So if you were to increase the carbon dioxide concentration in a leaf cell or in the air surrounding a plant, you would increase the rate of photosynthesis because carbon dioxide is one of the essential reactants for that equation. And if you were to perform the reverse, maybe you were to seal a plant in an airtight jar and slowly remove carbon dioxide, you would decrease the rate of photosynthesis. And I'll talk about something else here in just a minute in regards to carbon dioxide concentrations. Temperature is also an important consideration for plants. We typically associate plants with warmer weather. They don't necessarily enjoy really cold weather or really hot weather, right? Like most organisms, they prefer the temperate range, right? The middle range. And so most plants prefer a warmer temperature. If the plant becomes too cold or too hot, the enzymes that drive these reactions could become denatured. There are also some other consequences associated with a decrease in temperature or an increase in temperature. For example, if you have a substantial decrease in temperature for most plants, the water inside of the cells could crystallize and expand and rupture the cells. Or if the temperature got too high, you could increase the pressure because water likes to expand when it increases in temperature inside of a cell. And then the actual amount of water available for the plant would be an important consideration because water is one of those essential reactants in photosynthesis. Decreasing or increasing the amount of the available reactants would also increase or decrease the rate of the reaction. So if a plant did not have access to water, the rate of photosynthesis would decrease. Now, if you increase the amount of available water, you could increase the rate of photosynthesis. Now, however, you need to realize that most of these environmental factors are not factors that you can infinitely increase to achieve an infinite increase in photosynthesis. For example, if we look at these graphs, here on the y-axis, we have the rate or speed of photosynthesis. And on the x-axis, we have light intensity, right? And so down here would be zero, no photosynthesis and no light. Maybe you're growing the plant or you have the plant in absolute darkness. So obviously no photosynthesis will be taking place. Now, if you were to increase the amount of light available to the plant, you're going to increase the rate of photosynthesis. However, this rate of photosynthesis will eventually reach a plateau, right? A maximal rate, and will not increase any further. Whether you're adding, 10,000 extra lumens, you're not going to see an increase in photosynthesis. Now, why might that be? Well, you have to ask yourself, what part of the leaf anatomy or plant anatomy, the leaf, would be responsible for capturing this solar radiation? Well, we think about the mesophyll cells containing the chloroplast. There's not an infinite number of chloroplasts. Therefore, there cannot be an infinite absorption of solar radiation. And within the chloroplast itself, there's not an infinite amount of light-trapping pigments like chlorophyll or the carotenoids. So there's only so much solar radiation that plants can absorb and can work with in a given period of time. In fact, there have been a lot of studies looking at the amount of sunlight or amount of light in regards to time or duration that would allow a plant to reach its maximal rate. And a lot of plants, it's somewhere between 16 and 18 hours. Any time after that, the plant cannot utilize the sunlight or the light So if you're growing plants inside, it would not be beneficial to have the lights on for 24/7 because they'll only be able to use the light for a certain duration of time. And then in those excess hours, you'd simply be wasting your money. And we can see that same trend with carbon dioxide, right? You increase the rate of carbon dioxide, you increase the rate of photosynthesis, but eventually it levels off. Why might that be? Well, for the very same reason. There's not an infinite number of chloroplasts to perform photosynthesis. And you can also think about the available openings, right? So the stomata, the openings in the bottom of the leaves that allow carbon dioxide in, that's not an infinite surface area, or there's not an infinite number of those openings. So there's only so much carbon dioxide that can be absorbed by or allowed in through those stomata. And even the rate of carbon dioxide production in the plant is not infinite, so it'll eventually level off, more than likely being the result of a finite amount of chloroplast. And then if we look over here at temperature, right? So here be really cold and here be really hot. You can see that the rate of photosynthesis increases as we increase temperature, but then eventually it reaches a peak or optimal temperature before decreasing. And these lower temperatures and higher temperatures, these extremes, could result in the denaturation of proteins and enzymes like rubisco. And it could also change the physical properties of what's going on inside of the plant. Like I said before, extreme cold causing water to expand and crystallize, and the water would expand and crystallize. And then over here, it could also expand as well, creating a change in pressure inside of the plant. Now, there's one other thing that I want to talk to you guys about, and that's oxygen concentrations, right? Now, oxygen is a waste product or a byproduct of photosynthesis, and plants typically want to remove oxygen from the chloroplast immediately. And there's a reason for this, because the rubisco enzyme that fixes carbon dioxide also has an affinity or slight attraction to oxygen. And if oxygen is present, oxygen will bind to rubisco and prevent carbon dioxide from binding. And it will produce a product that is not usable by the plant. And so the presence of oxygen around rubisco actually significantly reduces the efficiency or productivity of photosynthesis. So the plant wants to get rid of that oxygen gas. Now, this can be quite complicated because under certain conditions, say, for example, a drought where there's not a lot of water or a really high temperature, plants will typically close their stomata, right? So those tiny little openings underneath the leaves, they'll close them and they will not allow air in and out of leaves. And since no air can come in, no air can come out, and that means that oxygen cannot leave the leaf. And so there are different forms of photosynthesis that have evolved as a way for plants to meet these stressful conditions. Typically, when we talk about photosynthesis in most plants, we talk about C3 because the end product of the light-independent reactions is a 3-carbon sugar. There's 2 of them that eventually get combined into glucose. There's also C4, right, which produces an intermediate compound as a way of storing carbon dioxide during high temperature periods where the stomata need to be closed. And that way it can increase the amount of carbon dioxide to oxygen ratio inside of a plant, inside of the chloroplast, to prevent oxygen from binding with rubisco. And then you've also got the CAM plants, C-A-M, and that is a type of photosynthesis that occurs in arid plants or plants that are really well adapted for arid climates, such as a cactus or even a pineapple. And these plants actually store carbon dioxide temporarily in the form of malic acid at night so that there's a lot of extra carbon dioxide when it comes time to form sugars. What's interesting about CAM plants, cactus and the like, at night, if you were to eat them, they would actually taste incredibly sour because the malic acid, and most acids have a sour taste. But during the day, when the plant is busy performing photosynthesis and converting those acid compounds into sugars, it would taste sweet. So depending on when you harvest these certain plants, if you are harvesting them for human consumption, could affect their flavor, which is kind of neat. So C3 photosynthesis is what we typically talk about, and that's most plants. C4 actually is a type of photosynthesis used by grasses. So a lot of grasses use C4 photosynthesis. And if you think about where grasses grow, they're typically exposed to a lot of sunlight and high temperatures. So they need to close those stomata frequently to prevent water loss and to prevent drying out. Well, that's all I have for the factors that affect the rate of photosynthesis. But I will leave you with one question. What else could affect the rate of photosynthesis? And ultimately, you have to ask yourself, if enzymes and proteins are performing a majority of these functions, what environmental factors could affect enzymes? And if they affect enzymes, they will affect the rate of photosynthesis.